Good. All right, so as long as we're clapping, let's clap for Blaire.
Okay, I'm going to start off by telling you guys a little bit about myself. I've had the opportunity to see a lot of your guys' art through critiques and talk to a lot of you, but I don't know how much you know about me. I grew up in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. I have 2 dogs. The one closest to me is my dog Ben, my dog Charlie, and the other is of my wife playing mermaids at the pool. When I'm not here at MSU, you can probably find me at the Beavers hockey games. Me and my wife frequent them, big hockey fan. I also garden a lot, hang out with friends and family, go fishing, or just am a homebody. From a really young age, I was always interested in art. I remember being really little and I would ask my mom to sit with me at the dining table and draw with me, and every time she would say, no, I'm bad at drawing, and not sit down with me. But that kind of led into an outlet. When I was in high school, I took all of our classes to get away from personal things. My uncle was sick with cancer. I had lost my grandparents, and art was really a way of dealing with grief and loss. And I really liked drawing and painting at that time. I took art ceramics class, but my high school ceramics teacher was just a guy that knew how to run a kiln, so we didn't learn much, and nothing really turned out well, and I hated it until I started my BFA in 2016, when I really switched to doing ceramics. So during this talk, I'm going to show you guys some of the works that I made in my undergrad, leading up to my solo thesis exhibition, what I did after my undergrad, and what I'm kind of doing now. As part of the honors degree at Blaire Engel University, you do 2 years leading up to a thesis. The first year is trying to figure out what you're going to do for that show. You look into artists and kind of work that way, and then we have a solo exhibition, kind of like you guys have capstone. During that process of planning, one of my show ideas was to make these abstract works of thrones, spheres, and they were about showing growth and the feeling of incompleteness. I was working with the idea of queer abstraction and really trying to find a subtle way to work queerness into my work without it being in your face rainbows. Inside Myself was a work I made during this time. This piece was about the different perspectives and layers of a person. I wanted it to speak to who I was inside and how one side of yourself people see, but if you go to the other side, someone else might see a completely different person. Some of the circles are more closed off and layered, and then inside the work has some glass that was melted in the kiln. And I had this work at the Art Gallery Self-Master in Dakota in 2020. Also during this time, I made this work called Questioning. This was a decorated, ambiguous bust that represented figuring out identity specific to sexuality and gender. The figure is connecting the pieces of themselves that they have figured out and leaving pieces open that are open to change and growth, and parts of themselves yet to be discovered. This work explored gender and sexuality through the contemporary art form of queer abstraction, using my own visual language about the relationship between an individual and their identity. In a lot of my work, you will see that I use textures, ink glazes, or surface textures that I created using tools. It's something I really like using in ceramics, and the vastness surfaces that you can create. In this work in particular, the white is a crawl glaze that separates during firing that I use to represent the not yet knowing of yourself or feeling comfortable in your skin. In 2022, this work was featured in a group exhibition titled Voices at the Canadian Clay and Glass Gallery in Waterloo, Ontario. This was the first time I had a work that I had to ship and wasn't in a local exhibition. This exhibition was planned when the pandemic hit and hate crimes in Canada increased by 37%. It ended up featuring 43 artists whose work spoke to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It was meant to bring voices to racialized minorities and members of the LGBTQ community. My work questioning started in my undergrad, but this exhibition occurred after I graduated, so now I'm going to kind of go back into what I was doing in my undergrad. But sometimes works make their way in progress into different spaces after you've completed them. So my thesis exhibition happened during COVID, so we did not have an open gallery, and unfortunately nobody was allowed to come into this space. To combat that, it's on YouTube, but every student had to do a Zoom artist talk that was like over an hour that like visually took you through the whole gallery. And although it was sad to not have people in the space, it was also interesting that anybody in the world could also join and see what was going on. My exhibition was titled With Time, and it conveyed my experience of being in a long-distance relationship on different sides of the Canadian and US border during the epidemic. While making artwork for this exhibition, I worked through my feelings of separation from my wife by putting my time and emotions into my art instead. It featured mixed media artworks made from clay, paint, wax paper, and Kleenex. Kleenex was very prominent as a material throughout to show its uses for sadness and sickness and fragility, relating to the sadness and emotions I dealt with over that year and the sickness that the coronavirus caused separation. The use of other materials also showed fragility, and I have one piece that I actually fired that was about strength. Adjusting is one of the works that I incorporated both paper mache Kleenex tissues and bone dry clay to make these ambiguous bus shapes. These pieces were kind of molded into each other but separated, so they had kind of a connection to each other but stood separately on their own. The white paper mache outside was like really layered. Well, when you looked on the inside with the slip clay, it was cracked apart and broken, which symbolized pain and heartache. This work was titled All My Emotions. It was an installation work within the show that consisted of these little tiny figures that showed pain, heartbreak, anxiety, depression. When I was making this work, I was speaking to my ceramics professor, and I said I didn't realize how hard it is to convey an emotion without facial expression or something, especially like happiness wasn't really what I was going for, but without a smile, it's really hard to be like, this guy's happy. So the concept of this work was to show the varying emotions that occurred during that year. And I used mixed media elements such as pins, nails, wire, a bunch of stuff, but these were all bone dry clay, so it was to show that the emotions were just temporary and they weren't lasting forever. those works where you can really see the mixed media aspects of it. The next couple of works I have in here are not ceramic, however, they are sculptural installation works that I made out of other mediums. This here is a quilt that I made named Please Lay With Me that I sewed out of Kleenex tissues on my sewing machine. The idea behind this work was to play with like crying so much that you end up like in a pile of Kleenex in your bed at night, and it kind of becomes this blanket. It was displayed on the ground of the gallery with folds and bunches that gave the appearance of an in-use or being-used bed. I chose not to put it on a pedestal or anything soft because I wanted the person to imagine themselves laying there, and it would not really give you comfort or warmth. This is another work I made with tissues called Day by Day. This work is a Kleenex box on a pedestal filled with these Kleenexes that all have pictures printed on them. The tissue box is spilling onto the floor, and I printed enough photos to represent every day that we weren't together. They showed this progression of time for me, where all these memories became like a calendar of time lost, but time that also didn't have a chance to exist. Here is like a more close-up shot, so you can see the details that were in those photographs. This is the last piece I'm going to show from this exhibition. It's called Standing Strong. This piece is two ceramic figures that had been fired in the kiln, so they are ceramic and not just bone dry clay, and they're the same heights as me and my wife. The statues were meant to show a presence of resilience and lasting time that I didn't show in the other works of the exhibition. And they were just meant to show that they would last longer than the rest of the things that were happening. And this is just an up-close detail of that work. It was extremely textured, and this was caused by coil building. These are all compression marks from the back of a wooden spoon where you just like beat the clay so that it's really compressed and won't crack in the kiln. But I felt like this texture really added like a skin-like or like weathered look to the piece. And then all those works that I just showed you were all in a group exhibition in 2021 with other thesis students at the Art Gallery Southwestern Manitoba. They picked pieces from everybody's work and then moved them and made a group exhibition. So some people did get to see some of those works in person. After I graduated from university, COVID restrictions were still in place. So I decided to move back home with my parents. At this time, a woman came up on my Facebook Marketplace and she was selling her whole paint-to-pot business, which came with hundreds of glazes and kilns and just everything, and I bought it. And so I started making production pottery and functional work out of my parents' garage for sale. I was really trying to figure out what I liked doing, and carving into works is something that I've always enjoyed because it brought my love of drawing into my pottery. This work here is just a vase with flowers on it, but I had put a picture on the internet when I was working on it. It wasn't finished yet. And a woman in New Jersey, ever since I started making these functional works, will pay me for them before they're even finished. So I have one collector out there. This is another detailed shot of some of my carving. This is actually a teapot that I made for one of my friends that live here. It's just a flower bouquet. In this carving, I did use a white underglaze inside the lines. It's hit or miss whether I'll do that or not. I tend to really like the feeling and look of raw clay. So in this brick here, this has no glaze on it at all. It's just carved into raw clay. This is another one of those works on a different clay body, but I like to work with these really iron-rich dark clays like you saw in the last three. They call it a coffee clay, but it fires almost black, and I find that that really retains the imagery when carving, but this is more of a subtle carving into a lighter clay body. So what now? I moved here to America and waited on my green card after all the COVID stuff was kind of done. And when I met Ryan this summer to take up this residency, I really had to ask myself, what am I making? Because I hadn't made work in a few years leading up to being here. Something I've really been enjoying is working with Linda Olson, and we have been pit firing ceramics. It's a traditional technique that kind of started where you would dig a hole in the ground, fill it with manure, sawdust, wood chips, paper, and fire your ceramics that way. Here we don't dig a hole, we use the outdoor fire brick kiln, but it gives you the same results. This work here has a solution of ferrofrit 3110 and copper carbonate, which gives it that really deep red color. This is a little more sciencey, but in pit firing, you use dry oxides typically that create colors due to the smoke and the fire. And unlike the glazes you would put in the kiln, they don't do something that we call fluxing out, which means that the silica within the solution melts and creates that really nice, glassy look that a glaze would have. And me and Linda are trying to make our pit fire flux out. So the 3110 is a low, has a low melting point. So when you mix it with these oxides, we have had pieces turn to glass, and we're really trying to figure out how to balance that within a pit fire. This is another pit fire work that I had come out. This has more of a traditional solution on it using different varieties of salt and copper carbonate. Salts are a really typical additive to pit fire ceramics because of the colors they create, but also they have a really low melting point, melt point, that creates these really beautiful blacks and oranges. So aside from that, during my residency here, I have been making birds. I started making birds over the summer. I don't know if you guys are sci-fi novel readers, but Jeff Vandermeer has a book called The Strange Bird, which is like my favorite book in the world. And when I wasn't sure what I wanted to make, I just made my own strange bird. And he kind of falls in this universe of like biotechnology, transgenic life forms, and there's like hints to genetic modification within this sci-fi world. So when I started making my birds, I started researching all of these sciencey things that I never thought I would learn, and went down the rabbit hole of learning about like featherless chickens and see-through frogs and they're trying to make human organs for transplant inside of pigs, like all these things that they're doing with animals, and how that this made up world about animals taking over and being part human and part technology isn't that far off of something that could happen in the real world. This was the first bird I made. He's covered in a black iron wash, and I actually fired him in the pit fire. It's hard to see in this picture, but up close, he's got like these little spots of copper that like adhered to him. And I just thought it was fitting to put him in this big fire when he's from the apocalypse. This is another bird I made in reference to the novel. I never really had a big interest in birds in particular before I started this work, but I did grow up really close to my grandfather, who was really into birds, and he would see squirrels outside his house that would try and eat out of his bird feeders, and he'd shoot them with his BB gun so that they wouldn't scare his birds away. So I kind of feel like these freaky, funny birds kind of connect to him in a way. And they kind of sit in this space of fantasy and science. And at the end of my residency, there will be an exhibit at the Northwest Art Center where I'll have all of the works that I made during my time here on display, so you guys will get to see them in person. And I don't really know how long I'll stay on this topic and explore birds before I move on, but I just thought that it's so great that we're artists, and once we feel like we're not interested in something or it doesn't bring us joy anymore, we can just make something else. That's it.
Question?
Yeah,
So hand building or wheel throwing, what do you like to do best?
a mixture of both. I love throwing, but when I make like my birds or like other works, they're all made sculptured by hand, and I don't use any.
Do you have like basically you and you guys have a certain time frame? Are you still doing the pit firing and stuff like that, and would that be shared and posted?
Yes, we've been trying to get people involved. We probably won't fire this term as the weather gets colder. It gets a little more difficult, but I'll make sure that when we start up in the spring and it's warm enough to pit fire, that everybody will know what's going on, and maybe we'll give a lesson of all those oxides and what they do and what can happen.
So after your residency, what are your plans?
I really don't know. I've been talking with Linda, thinking about doing my MFA at UND, and I've been in contact with them, and that's a route, but also starting my family's a route, so I'm not super sure what direction I'm going to take yet.
I really enjoyed the prints you did on the Kleenexes. How did you do this?
So actually I took a Kleenex and double side taped it to a piece of paper, and then when you run it through your printer, just the top, like a 3-ply Kleenex, just the top ply comes off. So it was just like super thin and just held that ink after it dried. And it didn't wreck my printer, but
So like, how good of a mermaid is your wife?
I don't know. We'll have to do a mermaid competition. Any other questions?
When you were in the production phase, what I don't know if we saw a lot of that kind of stuff, but what kind of things were you making then?
Oh, I was making like mugs and bowls and cups, stuff that's all functional that people would want to have in their homes, and just selling them at local markets to pay for a living.
Carving into them, or?
Yeah, I carved into a lot of them. Some were just like basic, just glazed cups or things like that.
With the standing tall piece, how long did that take you?
It took me the whole year. It was all coil built in sections because it wouldn't fit in the kiln. You can see all of the lines of where it had to be connected, and then they were built on top of each other, and then once they were fully built, they were all fired, and then the rest of it was in a reduction gas kiln to do the glaze. And then it's all assembled with like a glue tack so that it would stay together, because I still have to transport it from the gallery to my house.
And it's heavy.
Who do you think is the best art professor at Minot State University?
I don't know. I work the most with Linda, but she's not a professor anymore.
What's your favorite piece?
I don't know. I think as anybody that makes things, like every single work that I make, even if it's just a bowl for someone, somehow has a connection to me. I feel that in ceramics personally, because I have to touch every little particle of the clay before it's done, and if it doesn't make it through all the stages, it doesn't really turn out as anything. I was asked this by a student the other day, and I told her that I loved this face when it came out. And when I was asked if someone could buy it, I was like torn apart of whether I should say yes or not. But I was also needing to make money at the time, and could always remake it one day, but all of them just hold a different piece of me.
Blaire, you're 4 years out from graduating, is that right? You graduated in 2020?
My last year was my thesis, so I started in 2016 and graduated in May of 21.
So much of your work in your thesis seems tied to the pandemic. Now that we're a couple of years out, you're out of graduation, as you look back at that work, what rises out about that experience, and is there any kind of summation comment that you can think about, just like how tied, again, about that relationship of the work to the pandemic?
I think it's having shared space with other artists, especially in your undergrad, should be something that you don't take for granted. Working close with other people. When it came to COVID year and making this work that was like so personal, and came from like a really sad time of being in a city where I had no family. You couldn't really see your friends. Canada's restrictions were very strict. Like, you could not go to a restaurant if the person with you did not have the same address on the ID. Like, you couldn't go anywhere. And then making a body of work alone at a space where I was also working and having students that I could talk to, and you kind of influence off each other. It was really difficult and different to work in an isolated space. I think that when I look at it, I see it in my work where it's very centralized in emotion, whereas now I kind of make work about things I like or have interest in, where it's like during that time, it was just an outlet for those feelings.
I know from being from Canada too, and for you, like saying that the like restrictions were really bad. I remember my mom coming to see me twice, and she literally had to get like put on quarantine twice for 14 days, and all we did was like just meet at the border and hug, and they're like, oh no, you're like on quarantine, and then they had people calling you and stuff like that. But I'm just wondering, how long was it before you actually were able to see your wife again, like after like when COVID was happening?
So it started in March of 2020, which is funny because we were on spring break. And so the day I was here visiting, the day I got home, the border closed. And from there until December, so like 9-10 months, Sam got special permission to visit. And so this was about halfway through making this show, which kind of changed things a little bit. And the painting pieces I had that I didn't show today were more about us being able to see each other for that small point in time. But when she came to visit, we also had to do 2 weeks quarantine. So she was in my apartment, but we couldn't see each other for 2 weeks. And then she had to go back, and then it wasn't until November, so another 11 months before we saw each other again. But during that Christmas break, when she was here, we did get married and had a Zoom wedding, and we could only have 3 people at the courthouse be there, which was my parents, and Sam's mom will never forgive me that she couldn't be there. But we just hoped that it would help with the process, because they were saying married people or like close family might have some kind of give with visiting. And because Sam always lived here and I always lived there, we weren't even common law or anything like that. So we had hoped that would change things, but I don't really know if it made a difference.
For your birds, like, is there like a specific bird that you reference every time, or is it like different birds?
I like to look at birds. If any of you ever come and visit me in my office, I have just walls of drawings of different birds that I like to look at. But when I start sculpting, it's purely just what I feel at the time and how I want that bird to look. They're not finished yet, but I have some mugs that I'm working on that have little birds on them in Pioneer, and some of them are like a blue jay, like an actual bird, and some are like these fantasy birds that I created. Any last question?
Do any artists inspire you, like a favorite artist or someone that we should know or look at the work of that person?
My favorite artist since I started ceramics in my undergrad has been Beth Kapner. If you are into ceramics and making sculptures, she is definitely someone to check out. And I find as artists, we kind of give a little bit of our process, but like not the whole thing. If you go to her website, she has like hour-long tutorials on how she makes these huge animal sculptures and the grinding and the parts that you have to make and how they fit together. And she's really open about how to make really large works.